The wagon ruts were deep and frozen, and the journey from the depot had taken the better part of a day. By the time the hired rig crested the final rise and the driver pulled the reins tight, the November light had gone thin and colorless, like water left too long in a glass. Clara Whitfield stepped down before anyone could offer a hand. Her boots met the packed earth of the farmyard, and for a long moment she did not move. She simply stood there, her gloved hands clasped at her waist, her breath rising in small clouds, and looked at what remained of her uncle's legacy. The house was a story and a half of weathered clapboard, the porch sagging at one corner where a post had rotted through. The barn beyond it leaned visibly to the west, its roof a patchwork of cedar shakes and tar paper and hope. And spreading out from the barn, running down a gradual slope toward a creek that she could hear but not yet see, lay the vineyard. 3 acres of gnarled vines growing wild among waist-high brambles and milkweed, the trellises fallen in long rows like the ribs of something that had died slowly and without witness. Welcome to Frontier Secrets. I am your narrator, Elias Vance. Here we unearth the forgotten stories of the American frontier, the women who built legacies from dust, the farmers who turned mockery into triumph, the quiet ones who refused to believe that the land had nothing left to give. This is the story of Clara Whitfield, a woman who arrived in the Shenandoah Valley with a teacher's salary, a widow's grief, and a crumbling piece of paper that said she owned a vineyard she had never seen. She had come from Philadelphia, where her late husband had been a professor of natural philosophy. He had left her a small annuity, barely enough to live on, and a library of books on botany and soil science that weighed more than all of her dresses combined. The inheritance of the vineyard had seemed, at first, like a cruel joke. A man she barely remembered had left her land he had never worked, in a valley she had never visited, with debts that had accumulated faster than the blackberries that now choked the vines. But Clara had looked at the letter from the county attorney, read the line about the 6-month lien, and made a decision that her neighbors in Philadelphia had called reckless and her friends had called worse. She had sold the books. All of them, every volume her husband had collected over 30 years of teaching and research. She had packed her trunk with the plainest clothing she owned and taken the train to a station so small the conductor had to point it out to her. And now she stood in the yard of a vineyard that had not produced a marketable crop in 7 years, with exactly $112 remaining in her purse, and 61 days to prove that the land was worth keeping. The driver unloaded her trunk and her crate and her 2 canvas bags, accepted the fare with a look that mixed pity with something closer to curiosity, and climbed back onto his seat. He did not ask if she would be all right. Perhaps he already knew the answer. He simply clucked to the horses and drove away, the wagon wheels grinding over the frozen ruts, and left her alone with the silence and the cold and the long rows of ruined vines. She stood there until the sound of the wagon had faded entirely. Then she picked up her trunk by the leather handle and dragged it across the porch. The door was not locked. It had not needed to be. Inside, the cabin was clean in the way that abandonment is clean. Nothing left but the bare furniture and the smell of wood smoke gone stale. A stove, a table, a chair with a split cane seat, a bed frame in the corner with no mattress. She set her trunk down in the middle of the floor and stood in the dim light filtering through the single window, and she did not weep. She had done her weeping on the train, in the dark between stations, when no one could see her face. Now she had work to do. She spent the first 3 days exploring. Not the house. She would deal with the house later. She explored the land, walking the rows of the vineyard with a notebook and a pencil, stopping at every 10th vine to crouch and examine the base of the trunk, the condition of the old wood, the evidence of disease. She found black rot on at least a third of the vines. She found evidence of grape phylloxera, the tiny aphid that had devastated vineyards across the continent, in the gnarled root knots she uncovered with her bare fingers. She found that the soil had compacted into a hard, impermeable crust, so that even the light rain that fell on the second night pooled on the surface instead of sinking in. She found that the trellises had collapsed in places where the wire had rusted through, that the blackberries had woven themselves into the vines so thoroughly that it was impossible to tell where one plant ended and the other began. She wrote all of it down. the numbers, the patterns, the condition of each row. Her husband had taught her to observe systematically, without emotion, without despair. Despair was a luxury for people who had time to waste. She had 61 days. On the 4th day, she walked to the creek. It was a small thing, running clear and cold over a bed of rounded stones, and she followed it downstream for nearly a mile until she came to a bend where the bank had been undercut by spring floods. There, growing in the rich, dark soil of the floodplain, she found something that stopped her mid-step. A thicket of wild sunchokes, their stems brown and dry now, but the soil around them loose and dark and crawling with earthworms. She crouched and dug her fingers into that soil. It was alive. It crumbled at her touch. It smelled of damp earth and good decay, and she sat there for a long time, her hand buried in that living dirt, and thought. The vines were dying because the ground was dead, compacted, poisoned by decades of the same treatment, starved of organic matter, infected with pests that had no natural predators to keep them in check. The sunchokes were thriving because the floodplain soil was deep and loose and full of the things that made soil fertile. She could not flood the vineyard, but she could make it breathe again. She returned to the cabin in the dusk and lit the lamp and opened her husband's old agricultural notebook, the one she had kept even after selling the rest of his library. She had memorized most of it on the train, but she needed to read the passage again, the one about the use of livestock in restoring exhausted land. She turned the pages slowly, her finger tracing the words her husband had written in his steady, precise hand. The most effective means of breaking soil compaction, reducing pest populations, and incorporating organic matter without mechanical plowing is the systematic grazing of animals. Pigs are the most thorough. But goats will clear brush, fertilize, and aerate in a manner that no machine can replicate. Goats will reclaim land that has been given up for lost. She closed the book and sat in the silence of the cabin, her breath clouding faintly in the cold air. And she made her decision. If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets and stay by the fire a little longer. For Clara Whitfield, the fire was small and the night was long, but the decision she made in that dim cabin on the 4th night would echo through the valley for years to come. She went to town the next morning. The nearest settlement was a cluster of buildings called Mill Creek, no more than a general store, a blacksmith, and a church that doubled as a schoolhouse when the weather was bad. She walked the 3 miles because there was no one to drive her, and she arrived at the general store with the hem of her dress wet from the frost and her cheeks flushed from the cold. The storekeeper was a man named Emmett Hargrove, broad-shouldered and slow-moving, with the careful eyes of someone who had seen many people come to the valley with plans that did not survive the first winter. He listened to her request without interrupting. When she finished, he set down the box of nails he had been sorting and leaned against the counter. "Goats," he said. "You want to buy goats." "A herd," she said. "As many as I can afford." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing his words. "Ma'am, I don't mean to tell you your business, but goats are troublemakers. They'll eat your garden, your clothesline, your hat if you leave it on a fence post. And they are not known for improving vineyards. They'll strip the bark off every vine you got and leave you with nothing but bare wood." "I know what they do," she said. "I need them to do exactly that." He shook his head slowly and told her he could not help her. But he could point her toward a family up in the hills, the Cordero family, who raised goats on the rocky slopes above the valley and might be willing to sell a few. "They keep to themselves mostly," he said. "But if you're set on this, you'll have to go to them. They won't come to you." She thanked him and bought a small bag of flour, a tin of salt, and a box of matches. And she walked back to the vineyard with the afternoon light fading behind her. She spent the next 2 days preparing. She cleared the cabin's single room of everything that could be eaten or broken, moved her trunk into the corner where the goats could not reach it, and reinforced the fence that surrounded the vineyard as best she could with the wire and posts she found in the barn. The fence was old and sagging, and she did not have enough materials to make it goat-proof, but she made it goat-resistant. It would have to be enough. On the 7th day, she walked into the hills. The trail was steep and winding, and the frost had made the ground treacherous in the shaded places. She climbed for 2 hours, following the directions the storekeeper had given her, and she found the Cordero place in a narrow valley between 2 ridges. A small cabin, a smokehouse, a barn built into the side of the hill, and goats. Dozens of them, moving across the rocky slope with the casual precision of creatures that had been born knowing exactly how to navigate difficult ground. An old woman came out to meet her. She was small and lean, with silver braids wrapped around her head and hands that looked like they had been made for gripping rope and rocks. She introduced herself as Lucia Cordero, and she listened to Clara's story with the same stillness that Clara had learned to cultivate in herself. When Clara finished, Lucia nodded once and walked her to the goat pen without another word. They settled on a price: 20 goats. A mix of does and wethers, 6 months old, healthy, accustomed to rough country. Clara paid with nearly everything she had left, counting the coins into Lucia's palm with steady hands. The old woman looked at the money, then at Clara, and said, "You bring them back in the spring if they don't work out. I will buy them back at half price." It was not charity. It was not faith. It was a practical offer from someone who understood that sometimes the only thing a person needs is the chance to fail and try again. Clara accepted without argument. The journey down the mountain was slow. The goats did not walk in a straight line. They wandered, they tested the boundaries of the trail, they stopped to nibble at dry brush and frozen weeds. Clara had brought a rope and a crook, but the goats had their own ideas about direction, and she learned quickly that arguing with them was a waste of time. She worked with them, moving around them, letting them choose their path as long as it trended generally downhill. By the time she reached the vineyard, the sun was low and the cold was deepening, and she was exhausted in a way that went past her bones and into something deeper. She got them into the vineyard. The gate had been repaired, the fence mended to a point she hoped would hold, and she closed the latch behind the last goat and stood watching them spread out among the dead vines. They sniffed the air, they nibbled at the blackberry canes, they moved between the rows with the same unhurried curiosity they had shown on the mountain. And Clara stood at the gate with her hands resting on the top rail, her breath clouding in the cold air, and she prayed that she had not just spent everything she had on a herd of animals that would destroy the last chance she had left. The moon rose clear and cold over the valley, and the goats settled into the shelter of the barn, and Clara went inside her cabin and sat at the table with a candle and her notebook. She wrote down the date, the number of goats, the condition of the soil, the name of the old woman in the hills. She wrote down the words Emmett Hargrove had said at the store. And she wrote down the question she had been carrying since she made the decision, the question she had not allowed herself to ask aloud. What if they are right? She closed the notebook and blew out the candle and sat in the dark until her eyes adjusted and the shape of the window emerged from the blackness. Outside, the goats were quiet. The vineyard lay silver under the moon. And Clara Whitfield, alone in a valley that had already made up its mind about her, waited for the morning that would bring the first of the town's laughter. The morning came slowly, the sun climbing over the ridge in a pale wash of gold that did nothing to warm the air. Clara woke stiff from a night spent on a thin blanket laid over the bare bed frame, her breath visible in the cabin's dim interior. She had not undressed. There had been no point. The cold was a presence in the room, a tenant that had moved in and would not be leaving. She rose and built a fire in the stove with kindling she had split the evening before, her hands moving through the motions without thought. She had done this 1,000 times in Philadelphia, but there the wood had been delivered, and the coal had been ordered, and the warmth had been something she took for granted. Here, every stick of fuel she burned was a stick she had gathered and split herself, and she felt the weight of that in her shoulders as she coaxed the flames to life. The goats were waiting at the gate when she stepped outside. All 20 of them, pressed against the wire, their breath rising in a collective fog. They had not escaped. That was the first small mercy. She opened the gate and they streamed past her into the vineyard, moving with a purpose that surprised her. They went immediately to the thickest patches of blackberry bramble, where the canes had grown chest-high and woven themselves into the trellises, and they began to strip the leaves and the tender bark with a focused efficiency that looked almost like hunger, but was something more systematic than that. They were not merely eating, they were clearing. She stood at the fence and watched them for a long time. The morning cold seeped through her coat and her dress and her underthings, and she did not move to go inside. She was learning. The goats worked in a pattern she could not immediately discern, but there was a pattern. They moved from thicket to thicket, never lingering too long in one place, always returning to the edges of the cleared ground to browse the boundary between what had been reclaimed and what still needed work. They did not touch the grapevines, not yet. They favored the brambles and the thistles and the dry milkweed stalks that had taken over the spaces between the rows, and they left the gnarled grape trunks untouched. She had been told they would strip the bark. She had been prepared for that. But the goats seemed to know, with an instinct she could not explain, that the vines were not their food. They were after everything else. By noon, she had walked every row and noted every change. The goats had cleared a significant portion of 2 full rows, pulling down the dead canes, trampling the dried weeds, leaving behind a dark layer of droppings that would begin to break down and feed the soil. She crouched in a cleared section and pressed her fingers into the ground. It was still hard. But it was no longer completely sealed. The goat hooves had broken the crust in 100 small places, creating tiny channels where air and water could begin to move again. She returned to the cabin and ate a cold meal of bread and dried apple, standing at the window, watching the goats move through the vineyard like a slow tide. The silence was profound. No neighbors came to call. No wagon passed on the road. She was alone in a way that she had never been alone in her life. And the aloneness settled around her not like loneliness, but like a task she had not asked for. 3 days passed in this manner. She rose before dawn, fed the goats a small portion of hay to keep them friendly, and turned them into the vineyard. She walked the rows with her notebook, recording which blackberry patches had been reduced, which sections of vine had been exposed, where the goat droppings were thickest. She repaired sections of fence where the wire had begun to sag. She hauled water from the creek when the trough in the barn ran low. She ate her meals standing, sleeping shallowly, rising in the night to check that the goats had not discovered a weakness in the enclosure. On the 4th day, she walked to Mill Creek. She needed supplies: flour, salt, a new length of rope. She had $5 left, carefully folded in a small leather purse she kept pinned inside her dress, and she spent the 3-mile walk calculating exactly what she could afford and what she could not. The frost had held through the week, but there were signs of a change in the air, a dampness that spoke of rain, or perhaps snow, and she needed to prepare. The general store was warm. A wood stove burned in the corner, and 3 men stood around it, their hands wrapped around cups of coffee. They fell silent when she entered, and the silence was not the respectful kind. It was the silence of conversation interrupted, of words swallowed back. She met their eyes briefly and moved to the counter where Emmett Hargrove stood. He nodded to her. "Miss Whitfield." "Mr. Hargrove." She placed her order: flour, salt, coffee, a small bag of oats. He gathered the items without hurry, setting them on the counter in a neat row. Behind her, one of the men by the stove cleared his throat and said, in a voice pitched to Carrie, "I hear you've got yourself a herd of goats up there." She did not turn around. "Yes." "And you're running them through the vineyard?" "Yes." A pause. The man's voice came again, thicker now, amused. "I've been farming this valley for 34 years. I've never seen goats improve a piece of ground. They'll tear it up and leave you with nothing but dirt and regrets." She did turn then. The man was tall and broad, with a red face and small eyes set close together. He wore a good coat and a hat that had cost more than her entire wardrobe, and he was looking at her with the confidence of a man who had never been contradicted by anyone he considered worth listening to. "I'm not trying to improve the ground for next season," she said. "I'm trying to save it for the year after that, and the year after that." The goats are not the final measure. They are the first step. He laughed. It was not a kind laugh. "The first step to what? Bankruptcy? I heard about the price you paid for those animals. You could have bought a good plow horse for that money. You could have hired a team to disc the whole vineyard in 3 days. Instead, you bought a herd of beggars' livestock that will eat everything you own and then wander off to bother your neighbors." She did not answer. She had learned, in the years of her marriage, that there were arguments you could win and arguments you could not. This was the second kind. She paid Emmett Hargrove her money, took her purchases, and walked out of the store with her back straight and her face empty of expression. The three men were laughing as the door closed behind her. She walked home in the gathering cold, the sack of flour bumping against her hip, and she tried not to let the laughter follow her. But it did. It followed her up the lane and across the frozen pasture and all the way to the vineyard gate, where the goats were waiting for her with their patient, yellow-eyed gaze. She let herself into the cabin and built a fire and sat in the chair with the split cane seat, staring at the flame. She had been laughed at before. In Philadelphia, when she had announced her intention to go west. In her own family, when she had married a man twice her age who spent his salary on books instead of investments. She had been laughed at by people who had never taken a risk in their lives, people who measured success by the size of their bank account and the quality of their neighbors' opinions. The laughter was familiar. It was the laughter she had heard from her mother's friends when she had chosen to study botany instead of piano. It was the laughter that had followed her husband's funeral, when the relatives had gathered to whisper about what a widow with no children and no income would do with herself. She had done something. She had come here, and she had bought goats. She sat in the cabin until the fire burned low, and then she went back outside to check on the goats one last time before dark. They had bedded down in the clearest section of the vineyard, a half-acre near the creek where the blackberry canes had been reduced to broken stems, and the ground was already beginning to look different, softer, darker. She stood at the edge of that cleared ground and looked at what the goats had done in 4 days, and she felt something small and stubborn take root in her chest. It was not hope. Hope was too large a word for what she felt. It was more like recognition. She had seen something in the land that others had not seen, and the goats had confirmed it. The land was not dead. It had only been waiting for something that would work differently. On the 6th day, the frost came harder. She woke to a world turned white and brittle, the window glass etched with crystalline patterns, the air inside the cabin cold enough to sting her lungs. The goats were huddled in the barn, pressed together for warmth, their breath clouding in the dim light. She fed them extra hay and checked the water trough, which had skimmed over with ice. She broke it with a hammer and watched them drink, their small tongues working against the cold, and she knew that this frost was not the last. The winter was coming in earnest, and she had no shelter for the goats beyond the barn that leaned in the open vineyard. She spent that day reinforcing the barn's windward side with tar paper and scrap lumber. She worked alone, hammering and sawing, her hands growing numb inside her gloves, her breath coming in short, white bursts. The work kept her warm. The worry kept her working. On the 7th day, a wagon came up the lane. It was not a neighbor. It was not the land agent. It was a woman, middle-aged, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, driving a single horse with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times. She drew up at the fence and tied the reins and climbed down without waiting for an invitation. Clara met her at the gate. The woman was tall and raw-boned, with a face that had been shaped by weather and hard work, and she looked at the goats with an expression that was neither amusement nor disapproval. She looked at them the way a farmer looks at another farmer's livestock, measuring, calculating, assessing. "I'm Martha Deaver," she said. "I live 2 miles north, past the creek crossing. I heard about your goats." Clara waited. Martha pointed at the nearest animal, a young doe with a patch of brown on her left ear. "That one there is from Cordero stock. I recognize the markings. They're good animals, tough, smart. They won't give you trouble if you give them work." "I'm giving them work," Clara said. "So I hear." Martha looked past her, at the vineyard, at the sections where the blackberries had been cleared and the ground lay open. She looked for a long time, then she said, "I had a vineyard once, 20 years ago on the other side of the ridge. I lost it to phylloxera and bad advice. A man told me to plant deeper and water more, and I did, and the roots rotted, and the whole thing was gone in 2 seasons." Clara said nothing. She did not know what the woman wanted. Martha turned to face her. "I came to tell you that I don't think you're wrong. I don't know if the goats will work. But I've been watching that vineyard for 7 years, watching it die, and I've seen 6 men come and look at it and walk away. You're the first person who did something that showed you were paying attention. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Sunchoke roots. They'll grow in poor soil. You can break up the hardpan around the vines, plant them in between. They'll loosen the ground deeper than any goat can, and they'll give you something to eat come fall. My mother used to do it on the farm in Ohio. It's old knowledge, people forget. Clara took the bundle. The roots were knobby and dirt-crusted, and they felt heavy in her hands. "Thank you," she said. Martha nodded. "Don't thank me yet. The real cold hasn't come, and the town is not done laughing. But you've started something here, and I wanted you to know that not everyone in the valley is waiting for you to fail." She climbed back onto the wagon and drove away without another word, leaving Clara standing at the gate with the sunchoke roots in her hands and a strange warmth spreading through her chest. It was not hope, but it was close. She planted the sunchokes that afternoon, working the frozen ground with a spade, breaking the crust and pressing the knobby roots into the soil at the base of every third vine. The goats watched her from the far end of the vineyard, their heads raised, their ears swiveling. She worked until her hands ached and the light began to fade. And when she stood up and looked at the long rows of exposed ground and the small mounds where the sunchokes had been buried, she felt for the first time since arriving that the vineyard might not be a graveyard after all. That night a rider came from the county seat. He brought a letter sealed with wax, and he did not wait for a reply. Clara opened it by candlelight, her hands steady despite the cold, and read the words that told her the lien holder had filed a petition with the county court. The assessment of her claim had been moved up. The land agent would arrive in 30 days, not 60. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her notebook. She did not allow herself to calculate the difference. She allowed herself only to think about what she had done in the first 7 days, and what she could do in the next 30. Outside, the goats shifted in the barn. Somewhere in the valley, a dog barked once and fell silent. And Clara Whitfield sat alone in her cold cabin, holding a letter that told her the world had not given her the time she had asked for, and she did not weep. She had known grief before this. Grief was something you carried. This was something different. This was a problem, and problems were for solving. The morning after the letter arrived, the cold had teeth. Clara woke to find a thin skin of ice on the water bucket inside the cabin, and when she stepped outside, the air bit through her coat as if the wool were made of netting. The goats were standing at the barn door, waiting, their breath rising in columns of white. She counted them as she always did. 19, 20, all present, all alive, and she felt a small tightness in her chest loosen. They had made it through another night. She fed them and broke the ice in their trough and turned them into the vineyard. The ground was hard as iron, and the goats moved slowly, picking at the frozen weeds, their hooves clicking against the crust. She walked the rows behind them, her notebook in her hand, and she saw that the cleared sections had expanded. The blackberry brambles had been reduced to broken stems and bare canes. The droppings lay thick in the spaces between the vines, dark and promising, already beginning to break down. She crouched and pressed her fingers into the soil in a spot where the goats had worked the ground with their hooves, and she felt something that had not been there before. A give, a softness. The earth was breathing. She spent that day digging. The sunchoke roots Martha had given her needed to go deeper than the frost had penetrated, and she worked with the spade until her shoulders ached and her breath came in ragged bursts. She dug a hole at the base of every third vine, broke the compacted soil, mixed in a handful of the dry goat manure she had gathered from the barn, and pressed the knobby roots into the darkness. It was slow, painstaking work. The frost had locked the ground, and each hole required her full weight on the spade, levering against the resistance of the earth. By the time the sun began to slide behind the ridge, she had planted 12 roots. 248 vines remained. She went inside and ate a cold supper and sat by the stove with her notebook, calculating. At this rate, she would need 20 more days to finish the sunchoke planting. But the land agent was coming in 30. And she still needed to repair the barn roof, reinforce the fence, and somehow demonstrate that the vineyard was productive. The goats had done remarkable work, but remarkable work did not show on a ledger. The county wanted numbers, bushels, receipts, proof. She closed the notebook and stared at the stove fire, and let herself feel the weight of it all. The loneliness, the exhaustion, the laughter that had followed her out of the store and all the way home. She let herself feel it until her eyes burned and her throat tightened, and then she stood up and added another stick of wood to the fire, because the cold did not care how she felt. 2 days later, she went back to Mill Creek. She needed nails for the barn roof repair. She had found a roll of tar paper in the lean-to behind the cabin, but the roof boards had loosened in the wind, and she needed to fasten them before the real snow came. She walked the 3 miles in a thin, spitting rain that turned to sleet by the time she reached the store, and she arrived with her coat wet through and her fingers numb. Emmett Hargrove was at the counter, and the 3 men were at the stove. They were always at the stove. She had begun to wonder if they had been born there, if they simply materialized each morning from the steam of the coffee pot. The red-faced man was among them, and he looked up when she entered, and the same silence fell. She walked to the counter and placed her order: nails, a small tin of oil for the door hinges, a length of rope. Emmett gathered the items without speaking, and as he set them on the counter, the red-faced man pushed himself away from the stove and walked toward her. "You're that widow," he said. She did not respond. She was counting out coins from her small purse. "I asked you a question." "My name is Clara Whitfield," she said, not looking up. "I am a widow, but I am also a farmer, and I am in a hurry." He laughed. It was the same laugh from before. A farmer, with a herd of goats and a dead vineyard. That's what you call a farmer in Philadelphia? She placed the coins on the counter and picked up her purchases. "I call it a farmer when the crop comes in. You are welcome to call it whatever you like until then." She turned to leave, but he stepped into her path. He was not blocking her, not exactly, but he was standing close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath and the stale sweat of a man who spent his days standing at a stove. "I'll tell you what I call it," he said, his voice low enough that the others had to lean in to hear. "I call it a fool's errand. I call it a waste of good money and bad land. I call it the sort of thing a woman does when she has no one to tell her no." She met his eyes. "You have told me no. Several times, in fact. I have heard you, and I have continued. You won't continue long. That vineyard has been dead for 7 years. Nothing you do with a pack of goats is going to bring it back. You're burning your inheritance on a fantasy, and when the land agent comes, he's going to see exactly what I see, a woman who doesn't know when to quit." He said the last word with a small smile, and the men at the stove laughed. It was not a loud laugh. It was worse than loud. It was the quiet, knowing laugh of men who were certain they were right. Clara did not answer. She looked at him for a long moment, letting the silence grow heavy. And then she said, "I know when to quit. I quit Philadelphia. I quit the expectation that I would live out my days as a dependent relation. I quit the belief that a woman's worth is measured by her obedience. But I will not quit this vineyard until I have seen what it can become. And I would rather fail on my own ground than succeed on yours." She stepped around him and walked out of the store into the sleet, the nails and the rope and the oil can clutched to her chest. The door swung shut behind her, but she could still hear the laughter, muffled by the glass, following her down the steps and into the frozen street. She walked home in the failing light, and the sleet turned to snow, large wet flakes that melted on her coat and ran down her neck. She did not quicken her pace. She had no reason to. The work would be there when she arrived, and the cold would be there, and the loneliness would be there. She had learned to walk through these things without fighting them. She made it back to the vineyard as the last of the daylight drained from the sky. The goats were huddled in the barn, and she fed them, and checked the water, and made sure the tar paper she had nailed up the day before was still holding. It was not. A corner had pulled loose, and the wind was driving snow through the gap. She took the nails from her pocket and hammered the tar paper back into place with the butt of her spade, working in the growing dark, her fingers so numb she could barely feel the hammer. By the time she finished, the snow was falling thick and steady, and the ground had turned white. She stood in the barn doorway, watching the vineyard disappear under the blanket of snow, and she had a sudden hollow fear that all her work would be buried and forgotten. that the land agent would come and see nothing but a white field and write down his verdict without ever knowing what lay beneath. She shook the thought away. It was a useless thought. She had work to do. She worked through the next week with a ferocity that surprised her. She rose before dawn and worked until her hands bled, and then worked some more. She planted sunchokes in every break in the weather, driving the spade into the half-frozen ground, lowering the knobby roots into the darkness, covering them with soil that she had to crumble with her fingers because it would not break apart on its own. She repaired the barn roof on a day when the wind was so strong that she had to tie herself to the ridgepole with a rope to keep from being blown off. She discovered that the goats had begun to nibble the bark of the oldest vines, and she spent an afternoon wrapping the trunks with strips of canvas to protect them. On the 12th day after the letter, she lost a goat. It was a wether, one of the smaller ones, always a little slower than the others. She found it in the morning, lying against the far wall of the barn, its sides still and its eyes open. She knelt beside it and touched its neck, but there was no warmth, no pulse. The cold had taken it in the night, and she had not known. She had been asleep in the cabin, dreaming of Philadelphia, while one of her animals died alone in the dark. She did not weep. She had made a rule for herself: no weeping until the work was done. But she sat on the barn floor beside the dead goat for a long time, and she felt the weight of the loss settle into her like a stone. 19 goats left. 19 animals to carry the entire weight of her gamble. She buried the goat at the edge of the vineyard, under the withered remains of a blackberry thicket that the others had already cleared. She marked the spot with a small cairn of stones and went back to work. 2 days later, Silas Thorne appeared at her gate. She knew his name now. Emmett Hargrove had told her, in a low voice, when she had come to the store for more nails. Silas Thorne owned the largest farm in the valley, grew corn and wheat, and kept a herd of cattle that was the envy of 3 counties. He was a man who was used to being listened to, and he did not take kindly to being ignored. He was on horseback, and he did not dismount. He sat in the saddle, looking down at her, his red face flushed with cold or anger, she could not tell which. "Your goats got into my neighbor's garden," he said. "Walter Griffin's wife went out this morning to find half her winter cabbages destroyed. The tracks lead straight back to your fence line." Clara looked at her fence. It was intact. She had checked it that morning. "My fence is sound," she said. "Your fence might be sound, but your goats are not. Walter wants compensation, $3 for the damage." "I told him I would collect it from you myself." She looked at him. She had $5 left in her purse, carefully folded and pinned inside her dress. $3 would leave her with $2 to buy flour and salt and coffee for the remaining weeks before the assessment. "I will need to see the damage," she said. "The damage has been seen. Walter is an honest man. You can pay me now, or I can come back with the sheriff." She stood in the cold, her hands at her sides, and she calculated. She could argue. She could demand proof. She could insist on walking to the Griffin place and examining the cabbages herself. But Silas Thorne had the weight of the valley behind him, and she had nothing but 19 goats and a notebook full of observations. She reached inside her dress and unpinned the purse. She counted out $3 in silver coins and held them out to him. He took them without thanks, pocketed them, and turned his horse without another word. She watched him ride away down the lane, and she felt the thinness of her resources like a physical weight. $2. She could make $2 last for 2 weeks if she stretched every meal. But she could not afford to lose another goat, and she could not afford to repair a fence that was already sound. That night she sat in the cabin with the last candle burning, and she wrote in her notebook. She wrote down everything the goats had accomplished, every row of sunchokes planted, every section of ground turned and aerated and enriched. She wrote down the names of the neighbors who had laughed and the ones who had offered help. She wrote down Silas Thorne's name, and she wrote down a question that she did not know how to answer. What am I going to do when he comes back? The snow came in earnest on the 17th day. It began in the afternoon, a heavy, wet snow that clung to everything, and by nightfall it had accumulated 6 inches. She checked on the goats twice during the night, wading through drifts that reached her knees, and she found them huddled in the barn, the tar paper holding, the roof holding, the warmth of their bodies filling the small space with a fog that smelled of hay and manure and life. She woke on the 18th morning to a world transformed. The snow had stopped, and the sun was bright on the white expanse, and the vineyard vanished entirely. No vines, no brambles, no sunchokes, just a smooth, white field that could have been anything or nothing. She walked to the creek. It was frozen solid, the water silenced under a sheet of ice. She broke a hole with the spade and filled the goat's trough. And as she carried the water back to the barn, she noticed something. The snow in the vineyard was not uniform. In the sections where the goats had worked and the ground had been broken, the snow was melting faster. Pools of water lay on the surface, reflecting the pale sun. In the sections where the ground was still compacted and dead, the snow sat dry and untouched. She stood at the edge of the vineyard, the water trough heavy in her arms, and she understood. The ground that had been aerated was drinking the meltwater. The ground that had not was shedding it. Her goats had done more than clear brush and break crust. They had opened the earth to the winter moisture, the winter that would decide whether the vines lived or died. She set the trough down and knelt in the snow, pressing her bare hand into the wet, dark soil of a cleared row. It gave under her touch. It was cold, but it was alive. And for the first time in weeks, she smiled. It lasted only a moment. As she stood up, she saw a figure moving along the lane, walking toward the vineyard with a steady, unhurried step. It was a woman, bundled in a heavy coat, and as she drew closer, Clara recognized the gray braids and the lean frame. Lucia Cordero. The old woman reached the gate and stopped, looking at the snow-covered vineyard with the same measuring gaze she had given the goats on the mountain. She did not speak, she simply looked, and then she nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something she had already suspected. "You are still here," she said. "I did not think you would be." "I am still here," Clara said. Lucia opened the gate and walked into the vineyard, her boots leaving deep prints in the wet snow. She went to the closest row, where a patch of dark soil had opened around a vine, and she crouched and pressed her fingers into it. She held the dirt up to her nose, sniffed it, crumbled it between her thumb and forefinger. "The soil is changing," she said. "You have done something." "Goats," Clara said, "and sunchokes." "Martha Deaver gave me the roots." Lucia looked up at her, and there was something in her eyes that Clara had not seen before. It was not approval. It was not warmth. It was something closer to recognition. "Martha Deaver knew your mother?" "Not that I know of." Lucia stood up and brushed the dirt from her hands. "I came to see if you had sold them yet. The goats. I thought by now you would have given up and brought them back." "I haven't given up." Lucia looked at her for a long moment, and then she said, "I can see that." She turned and walked back toward the gate without another word. At the fence, she paused. When the snow melts, the real test comes. The goats have done their part. Now the ground must do its, and so must you. She walked away up the lane, her figure growing smaller against the white landscape. And Clara stood in the vineyard with her hands cold and her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. She had lost a goat. She had lost $3. She had lost the comfort of being unknown, of being invisible. But she had not lost the vineyard, and she had not lost her resolve. That night she wrote in her notebook, "I have endured the coldest days of the year. I have endured the laughter of men who measure success in bushels and acres. I have endured the slow, grinding fear that I might be wrong, but I am not wrong. I know it in my hands. I know it in the soil. I know it in the way the goats move through the vines. And I will survive this winter because the ground is learning to breathe, and I am learning to trust what the ground tells me." She closed the notebook and lay down on the thin blanket, the fire banked low, the cold pressing against the cabin walls. Outside, the snow lay deep and silent, and the goats slept in the barn, their breath rising in small clouds, and Clara Whitfield closed her eyes and dreamed of a vineyard in bloom. The snow melted slowly, as if the valley were reluctant to let go of winter. Clara woke each morning to the sound of dripping from the eaves, a steady music that told her the grip of the cold was loosening. She worked the thawing ground with a hand fork, turning the soil where the sunchokes had been planted, breaking up the clods that the frost had left behind. The goats moved through the vineyard with renewed energy, their hooves sinking into the softening earth, leaving behind a lacework of small impressions that collected the meltwater and held it. By the 22nd day, patches of bare ground had appeared across the vineyard. The blackberry canes lay broken and trampled, and the grapevines stood exposed, their gray bark darkening with the moisture that now reached their roots. Clara walked the rows every morning, notebook in hand, recording the changes she observed. The bark had begun to show signs of life. At the base of the older vines, where the trunk met the soil, she found tiny swellings. Buds, dormant but present, waiting for a warmth that had not yet arrived. She touched them with her fingertip, barely, as if they might crumble at the pressure, and she felt a tremor of something she did not dare to name. The sunchokes were slower. She dug carefully around one of the roots and found that it had begun to send out thin, pale tendrils. Not shoots, not yet. But the root was alive. It was reaching into the soil, breaking the hardpan, creating channels that the water could follow. She covered it back up and stood up, her knees wet and cold, and she looked across the vineyard and saw that the ground was no longer gray. It was dark. It was breathing. On the 25th day, she went to the creek and found the ice gone. The water ran clear and fast, swollen with melt from the ridges, and she knelt beside it and washed her hands. The cold water numbed her fingers, but she held them there, letting the feeling drain away, and she thought about the life moving through the soil behind her. The buds swelling, the roots reaching, the sunchokes tunneling, the goats digesting and depositing. The whole vineyard transforming in ways that no one in Mill Creek would see or believe until the evidence was forced upon them. She was returning to the cabin when she saw the wagon on the lane. It was not Silas Thorne's wagon. It was smaller, older, pulled by a single mule. The driver was a woman, young, with a child beside her. They stopped at the fence, and the woman climbed down with the careful movements of someone who was not used to traveling. "Are you the one with the goats?" the woman asked. Clara said she was. The woman nodded. "I'm Eliza Griffin. My husband is Walter Griffin, the one whose cabbages were ruined." Clara tensed. She had not forgotten the $3. She had not forgotten Silas Thorne's confident theft. But Eliza Griffin did not look angry. She looked tired. "I came to tell you that Walter was wrong," Eliza said. "The cabbages were not your goats. It was a deer. I saw it myself 2 mornings after he blamed you. But he wouldn't listen, and Silas Thorne had already taken your money." Clara said nothing. The woman shifted her weight, and the child in the wagon began to whimper. "Walter is a good man," Eliza said, "but he listens to Silas. Everyone in the valley listens to Silas. I can't give you the money back, we don't have it, but I wanted you to know that I know." She paused. "And I wanted to say that I think what you're doing here is not foolish. I think it might be the only thing that makes sense." She climbed back onto the wagon without waiting for a reply, and she drove away with the child crying and the mule plodding, and Clara stood at the fence with her hands cold and her throat tight. She had not known how much she needed to hear those words until she heard them. That night she sat by the stove and wrote in her notebook, "Someone in the valley has seen me, not what they expect to see, what I am trying to become, and that is enough for now to keep me going." The 27th day brought rain. It came in the afternoon, a steady, soaking rain that washed the last of the snow from the furrows and left the ground dark and slick. Clara worked in it, planting the last of the sunchoke roots, her hands blue with cold, her coat heavy with water. The goats had taken shelter in the barn, and she could hear them moving restlessly, their hooves clicking against the plank floor. She finished the planting just as the light began to fade. She stood at the end of the last row, the rain running down her face, and she looked at what she had done. Every vine had a sunchoke at its base. Every row had been turned and aerated and enriched. The ground was no longer hard and gray. It was dark and loose and alive. She had done everything she could do with what she had. The rest was up to the earth, and the season, and the patience she had learned to practice. On the 29th day the sun returned. It was a pale, thin sun, but it was warm, and the ground steamed as the moisture rose from the soil. Clara opened the barn door and let the goats out, and they streamed into the vineyard with a new energy. They had been confined for 3 days, and they moved through the rows with purpose, their heads low, their hooves working the softened ground. She watched them from the fence, and she saw that the sunchoke shoots had begun to push through the soil, pale green tips that looked impossibly fragile against the vast, dark earth. They had come. They had survived the cold and the wet and the waiting, and they had come. She walked to the nearest vine, the one she had marked on her first day as the most hopeless. Its bark had been gray and scabbed, its branches bare and brittle. Now, in the weak sunlight, she saw something that stopped her breath. At the joint where the main trunk divided into 2 branches, a tiny green nub had appeared. A bud. The first bud she had seen on any vine in the vineyard. She touched it with the back of her finger, barely, and it was firm and alive. She stood there for a long time, her hand hovering over the bud, and she felt the tears come. Not the tears of grief she had carried from Philadelphia, not the tears of exhaustion she had suppressed through the long, cold weeks. These were different. They were quiet and warm, and they came without struggle, the way a locked door opens when you finally find the right key. The land agent came on the 31st day. Clara saw the wagon coming up the lane from half a mile away, and she did not hurry to meet it. She finished the row she was working, cleaned her hands on her apron, and walked to the gate with a steady step. The agent was the same man who had come before, compact, brown-coated, his ledger case tucked under his arm. He tied his horse to the fence post and looked at her without greeting. "I'm here to assess the claim," he said. She nodded. "Come in." She walked him through the vineyard. She showed him the sunchokes, the turned soil, the goat manure worked into the earth. She showed him the buds on the vines, the first evidence that the plants were no longer dying. She showed him the cleared sections where the blackberry brambles had been reduced to kindling. She spoke calmly, without urgency, describing what she had done and why. He listened without interrupting. He took notes in his ledger. He crouched several times to examine the soil, to press his fingers into the dark loam, to inspect the buds on the vines. He did not smile. He did not frown. He was a man who had trained himself to show nothing. When he finished the tour, he stood at the far end of the vineyard, looking back at the long rows of awakening vines. The sun had broken through the clouds, and the light fell across the ground in bands of gold and shadow. "You started with nothing," he said. "A dead vineyard, a lean, 60 days. And you have done this." "I have done what I could," she said. He closed his ledger. "I will file my report. But I can tell you now that the claim will stand. This land is productive. You have proved it." He walked back to his wagon without another word. He untied his horse, climbed onto the seat, and drove away. Clara watched him go, and she felt the weight of the 31 days lift from her shoulders. Not all at once. Slowly, the way the frost lifted from the ground in the morning, patch by patch, until the whole field was warm. She turned back to the vineyard. The goats were lying in the sun near the creek, their sides rising and falling in the quiet rhythm of digestion. The sunchoke shoots were visible in every row, green and steady. And the vines, the old, gnarled, dying vines that everyone had given up on, were covered with buds so small they looked like seeds, but they were there. They were everywhere. She walked to the barn and leaned the spade against the wall. She went inside the cabin and built a fire and sat in the chair with the split cane seat, and for the first time since she arrived, she did not have anything urgent to do. The ground could rest. The goats could rest. She could rest. But outside, the sun was already beginning to sink toward the ridge, and she knew that the work was not done. The buds would need warmth. The sunchokes would need tending. The goats would need to be moved to fresh ground. And the town would need to see, with their own eyes, what she had done. She let herself sit for 10 more minutes. Then she stood up, put on her coat, and went back outside. The next morning, a delegation came from Mill Creek. She saw them from the far end of the vineyard, a cluster of figures moving along the lane, and at first she thought it was Silas Thorne and his men come to claim another debt. But as they drew closer, she saw that it was not Silas. It was Emmett Hargrove, the storekeeper, and behind him were 4 farm wives she recognized from her trips to the store, and behind them, walking with the steady gait of a woman who had made up her mind, was Martha Deaver. They stopped at the gate, and Emmett Hargrove took off his hat. He looked at the vineyard, at the green shoots of the sunchokes, at the buds on the vines, at the dark, turned earth that stretched in long rows to the creek. He looked for a long time. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "I came to apologize." She waited. "Silas Thorne has been telling stories about you since the day you arrived. He said the goats would ruin the vineyard. He said the vines were dead beyond saving. He said you were a fool playing at farming. And I listened to him." He paused. "I should not have. I should have come to see for myself." He gestured at the vineyard. "I am seeing for myself now, and I was wrong." The farm wives nodded. One of them, a small woman with a red shawl, stepped forward. "We came to ask if you would show us what you have done, for when we replant our own ground." Clara looked at them. She looked at Martha Deaver, who stood at the back of the group with her arms crossed and a faint, knowing smile. She looked at the vineyard behind her, at the work of 31 days, at the life that was returning to ground that had been given up for dead. She opened the gate. "I will show you," she said, "but you will have to walk. There is a lot of ground to cover, and I have only begun." She led them into the vineyard, and the farm wives followed in a loose cluster, their boots sinking slightly into the dark, turned earth. The morning sun had burned off the last of the mist, and the light fell in long golden bars between the rows, catching the tiny green buds on the vines and making them glow like embers. Emmett Hargrove walked at the rear, his hat in his hands, his eyes moving from vine to vine with the attentiveness of a man who had spent 30 years looking at land and was now seeing something he had never seen before. Clara stopped at the first row, where the sunchoke shoots had risen to the height of her knee. She crouched and pulled one gently from the soil, exposing the cluster of tubers that had already begun to form. "The roots go deep," she said, "deeper than the grape roots. They break the hardpan, create channels for water and air. When they die back in the fall, the channels remain, and the organic matter they leave behind feeds the vines." One of the farm wives, a woman named Hetty Parson, knelt and touched the exposed root with reverence. "I've never seen sunchokes planted in a vineyard," she said. "Neither had I," Clara said, "but I saw them growing wild by the creek, in soil that was alive. And I knew that the vineyard needed what they had." Martha Deaver spoke from the edge of the group. "My mother used to say that the best farmer is the one who watches what the wild plants do and learns from them. You've done that." Clara stood up and brushed the dirt from her hands. She moved to the next row, where the goats had been working the ground that morning. The animals had been moved to a fresh section, and their droppings lay scattered among the vines, dark and rich. She pointed at the soil. "The goats cleared the brambles that were choking the vines. Their hooves broke the crust. Their manure feeds the earth. But the real work is what happens below. The roots are drinking now. They were starving for years, and now they are drinking." The farm wives walked the rows in silence. They stopped at the third vine, the one Clara had marked on her first day as the most hopeless, and they saw the buds that covered its branches. One of them, a young woman with a baby on her hip, reached out and touched the nearest bud with her fingertip, and her face softened in a way that Clara recognized. It was the same softening she had felt herself the first time she had seen the buds. It was the softening of hope. Emmett Hargrove cleared his throat. "Miss Whitfield, I have a confession to make. When you first came to the store and told me you were buying goats, I thought you had lost your senses. I told myself it was a widow's folly, that you would be gone by Christmas. And when Silas Thorne started his talk, I let it stand. I did not correct him. I did not defend you." He paused and his voice dropped. "I am ashamed of that." Clara looked at him. She had carried the weight of his silence for weeks, and she had not realized how heavy it was until he lifted it. "You are here now," she said. "That is enough." He nodded, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, recognition. The delegation stayed for another hour. Clara answered their questions about the goats, the sunchokes, the timing of the planting, the repair of the fence. She showed them the notebook where she had recorded every observation, every change in the soil, every bud that had appeared. They listened with the focused attention of people who had been given a new language and were learning to speak it. When they finally left, walking back up the lane in the strengthening sun, Martha Deaver lingered at the gate. She turned to Clara and said, "There is still the summer to face. The bud break is only the beginning. The real test comes with the heat and the drought and the pests that will find these vines once they are green. You have done good work, but the work is not finished." "I know," Clara said. Martha nodded. "Then you know what you are up against. I will come back in a month. I want to see how the sunchokes are doing." She walked away without waiting for a reply, and Clara watched her go, feeling the weight of the warning settle into her chest. The buds were a victory, but they were a small one. The summer would bring new challenges, and she had no money, no reserves, no safety net. She had only the vineyard and the goats and the knowledge that she had been right so far. The weeks that followed were a slow, patient labor. The weather warmed, and the vineyard transformed. The buds swelled and opened, and the first leaves appeared, small and pale at first, then larger, darker, until the vines were covered in a canopy of green that cast dappled shadows on the turned earth. The sunchokes grew waist-high, their yellow flowers attracting bees that buzzed through the vineyard in a constant humming presence. The goats moved through the rows, their work shifting from clearing to maintenance, keeping the weeds down, fertilizing the soil, their hooves gently aerating the surface. Clara worked from dawn to dusk. She pruned the vines, training the new growth along the repaired trellises. She thinned the sunchokes where they grew too thick, harvesting the tender shoots for her own table. She hauled water from the creek when the rains were sparse, carrying bucket after bucket to the base of the younger vines. She repaired the barn roof a second time, and a third, and a fourth, always finding a new leak that the wind had opened. The solitude was no longer lonely. It had become a kind of companionship. She talked to the goats, she talked to the vines, she talked to the sunchokes, telling them to grow deep and strong. And in the evenings, she sat on the porch with her notebook, recording the day's observations, and the silence of the valley no longer felt empty. It felt full of things that were happening slowly, underground, beyond the reach of laughter. In the third week of May, Silas Thorne appeared at her gate again. He was on horseback, as before, and he did not dismount. He looked at the vineyard with the same measuring gaze, but there was something different in his face. It was not mockery. It was not anger. It was something closer to unease. "I heard the land agent approved your claim," he said. "He did. He should not have. The vines are green now, but they are weak. They have been starving for years. One bad season, one dry spell, and they will collapse. You have bought yourself a reprieve, not a victory." "I will take the reprieve," Clara said, "and I will work for the victory." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "You are a stubborn woman. I have been called worse." He did not laugh. He turned his horse and rode away without another word, and Clara watched him go, feeling the thin thread of tension between them tighten. He was not convinced. He would never be convinced, not until he saw the harvest with his own eyes. But the harvest was still months away. June came hot and dry. The creek dropped to a trickle, and the ground began to crack in the places where the goats had not worked. Clara woke each morning to a sky that was pale and cloudless, and she carried water until her arms ached and her back burned. The goats suffered in the heat, lying in the shade of the barn, their sides heaving. She moved them to the section of the vineyard nearest the creek, where the sunchokes had grown thickest and the ground retained its moisture. It was there, in the third week of June, that she found the first sign of trouble. The leaves on the easternmost vines had begun to curl at the edges, turning brown and brittle. She examined the trunks, the roots, the soil. She found no grubs, no aphids, no evidence of the diseases that had killed the vineyard before. But she found that the ground was dry 3 inches down, despite her watering. The sunchokes were drinking deeply, but the vines were not getting enough. She knelt beside the affected vine and pressed her fingers into the soil, feeling the dryness, the resistance. The sunchoke roots had broken the hardpan, but they had also drawn the moisture toward themselves, leaving the grapevine roots in a zone of relative drought. She had not anticipated this. She had thought the sunchokes would help, not compete. She sat back on her heels and looked at the long rows of green vines, and she felt the familiar weight of uncertainty settle over her. She had done everything right. She had followed the logic of the land, the lessons of the wild plants, the wisdom of her husband's notes. But the land was complex, and the lessons were never finished, and the wisdom required constant adjustment. She spent the next 3 days digging small basins around the base of each vine, creating depressions that would catch and hold whatever moisture fell from the sky. She mulched the basins with dry grass and straw, anything she could find, to slow the evaporation. She watered each basin by hand, carrying bucket after bucket from the creek, and she watched the brown edges of the leaves stop spreading. By the end of June, the vines had stabilized. The damaged leaves remained damaged, but the new growth was healthy, and the tiny clusters of grapes that had formed were small but numerous. Clara counted them one evening, walking the rows in the long twilight, and she estimated that there would be enough for a modest harvest. Not a commercial harvest, not enough to pay off the remaining debts, but enough to prove that the vineyard was alive, enough to show the valley. But July brought a new threat. It began with a rumor, carried by a passing wagon driver who stopped at the gate to ask for water. He told Clara that the valley to the east had been struck by an outbreak of downy mildew. The wet spring and the humid summer had created perfect conditions, and whole vineyards were being stripped of their leaves, their fruit rotting on the vine before it could ripen. He said the farmers were desperate, spraying copper sulfate, burning infected vines, praying for a frost that would kill the spores. Clara listened with a calm that she did not feel. Downy mildew had been the death of her uncle's vineyard, according to the notebook she had found in the cabin. It had taken hold in a wet year and never let go, weakening the vines year after year until they could no longer produce. She had assumed that the vineyard had been cleared of the infection by the years of neglect and the winter's cold, but she had not tested the soil. She had not examined the old wood for dormant spores. She walked the vineyard that afternoon with her heart beating against her ribs, examining every leaf, every cluster, every stem. She found nothing. The leaves were green and healthy. The fruit was small but firm. The vines had not been touched, but she knew that the disease could spread quickly. One infected leaf carried by the wind, one spore landing on the damp surface of a grape, and the whole vineyard could be lost in a matter of days. She went to the barn and mixed a solution of copper sulfate and lime, following the recipe her husband had written in his notebook. She sprayed the vines by hand, working from dawn until dusk, covering every leaf, every cluster, every inch of exposed wood. The goats complained at the strange smell, and the sunchoke flowers drooped where the spray fell on them, but she did not stop. She sprayed for 3 days. On the 4th day, a man rode up the lane. He was a stranger, a farmer from the Eastern Valley, and he was looking for advice. He had heard that a woman in the Clearwater Valley had revived a dead vineyard, and he wanted to know how she had done it. His own vineyard was dying, he said. The mildew had taken half his crop, and he was desperate. Clara walked him through the vineyard. She showed him the goat-turned soil, the sunchoke roots, the careful pruning. She gave him the recipe for the copper spray and told him to apply it at the first sign of infection. She watched him write down her instructions with the careful hand of a man who had never taken notes from a woman before, and she saw the hope flicker in his eyes as he looked at her rows of green, healthy vines. He thanked her and rode away, and she stood at the gate and wondered if the valley was beginning to change. The laughter had not stopped entirely, but it was quieter now. The mockery had given way to curiosity, and the curiosity was giving way to something that looked like respect. August arrived with a heat wave that flattened the grass and turned the creek to a muddy trickle. The goats suffered, and Clara moved them into the barn during the hottest hours, letting them out only in the early morning and late evening. The vines drooped in the heat, their leaves curling to conserve moisture, but the sunchokes stood tall, their deep roots drawing water from the depths of the soil. Clara watered the vines sparingly, forcing them to send their roots deeper, to find the moisture that the sunchokes were pulling up. It was a gamble. If the roots did not reach deep enough, the vines would die. But if they did, they would be stronger, more resilient, better able to survive the droughts that would come in future years. She walked the rows each morning, pressing her fingers into the soil at the base of the vines, feeling for moisture, for life, for the small daily victories that no one else would see. On the 15th of August, she found the first ripe grape. It was on the 3rd vine of the western row, the one she had marked as the most hopeless, the one she had touched with such tenderness on the day the buds appeared. The grape was small, no larger than the tip of her thumb, and its skin was a deep, dusky blue, covered in the pale bloom of ripeness. She touched it with her fingertip, and it yielded slightly, the skin thin and warm from the sun. She picked it. She held it in her palm, feeling its weight, its roundness, its sweetness. And she put it in her mouth and tasted the first fruit of the vineyard in 7 years. It was not the finest grape she had ever tasted. It was a little tart, a little thin, a reminder that the vines were still recovering, still learning how to be healthy again. But it was sweet, too, sweet with the sun and the soil and the work of her hands. Sweet with the long winter and the cold spring and the dry summer. Sweet with the laughter she had endured and the loneliness she had carried and the stubborn, unyielding belief that the land could be healed. She stood in the row, the taste of the grape still on her tongue, and she looked around at the vineyard, the green leaves, the dark soil, the goats resting in the shade of the barn, the sunchokes standing tall and golden in the late summer light. And she knew, with a certainty that went deeper than hope, that she had done what she set out to do. The harvest would come in September. The county agent would return in October to file his final report. And the valley would see at last what she had seen from the beginning, that the land was not dead, that the vines were not beyond saving, that the laughter of the skeptical was only the sound of people who had forgotten how to believe in the quiet, patient power of the earth. She walked back to the cabin in the gathering dusk, and she sat on the porch with her notebook open, recording the day's observation. First ripe fruit, western row, third vine. Small, but sweet. The vineyard is alive. And so am I. She closed the notebook and looked out at the vineyard, the rows of green and gold, disappearing into the blue shadow of the evening. The goats had begun to stir, their bells clinking softly as they moved toward the barn. And Clara Whitfield, who had arrived in November with nothing but a trunk and a notebook and a heart full of grief, smiled in the twilight, because she knew that the best part of the story was still to come. September came in with a breath of cool air that whispered of autumn, and with it came the rain. Not the gentle, soaking rains of spring, but hard, driving sheets that fell for 3 days without pause, turning the lanes to mud and swelling the creek to a brown, churning rush. Clara spent those days in the barn with the goats, patching leaks in the roof, checking the tar paper, keeping the animals dry. The vines stood in the downpour, their leaves heavy with water, and she watched them from the barn door with a knot tightening in her chest. Downy mildew thrived in wet weather. The spores needed only a film of moisture on the leaf surface to germinate, and the entire valley had been drenched. On the 4th day, the rain stopped, and the sun broke through. Clara walked the vineyard with her heart beating against her ribs, examining every leaf, every cluster. The grapes had swelled with the moisture, their skins tight and translucent, the deep blue deepening toward purple. She looked for the telltale signs of mildew, pale spots on the upper leaf surface, a white, downy growth on the underside. She found none. She walked the rows twice, then a third time, and found nothing but healthy green leaves and fruit that was ripening toward harvest. She let out a breath she had been holding for 3 days and leaned against the nearest vine, her hand resting on its trunk. The bark was rough and warm under her palm, and she felt the life in it, the steady pulse of a plant that had been given a second chance. But the valley to the east had not been so fortunate. The news came on the 7th day of September, carried by a wagon driver who had stopped at the store in Mill Creek and heard the reports. Whole vineyards had been stripped. The downy mildew had taken hold during the rain and spread like a fire through dry grass. Farmers who had sprayed too late, or not at all, had lost their entire crop. Leaves had blackened and fallen. Grapes had turned to wrinkled, rotting husks on the vine. The driver said he had heard of men sitting down in their fields and weeping. Clara listened with a strange, hollow stillness. She had escaped the disaster, but the disaster had been close. Close enough that she could smell it in the damp air, could see it in the anxious faces of the farmers who passed her lane. Close enough that she knew, with a certainty that settled into her bones, that she had been saved by nothing more than the timing of her spraying and the health of her soil. On the 10th day of September, Silas Thorne came to her gate for the 3rd time. He was not on horseback this time. He came on foot, walking up the lane in the mud, his boots caked, his coat hanging open, his face a mask of exhaustion. He stopped at the fence and did not speak. He looked at the vineyard. The leaves were green. The grapes hung in full clusters, deep purple, ripe and heavy. The sunchokes had begun to yellow, but they still stood tall, their roots holding the soil together, their presence a testament to the work that had been done. Silas Thorne opened his mouth and closed it. He took off his hat and held it in his hands, turning it slowly, the way a man turns a thing when he does not know what to do with his hands. He said, "I lost everything." Clara waited. She did not move to open the gate. "My entire vineyard, 30 acres. It was my father's and his father's before him. And it is gone. The mildew took it in 3 days. I sprayed. I did everything I knew to do. But the ground was hard, and the roots were shallow, and the vines could not fight it." His voice cracked. "I have nothing." She still did not speak. She let the silence hold them. He looked up at her, and his eyes were red-rimmed, not from weeping but from the sleepless nights of a man watching his livelihood die. "You knew," he said. "You knew what to do. You built your soil. You made the roots go deep. You sprayed before the rain, and your vines are standing." "Yes," she said. "I called you a fool. I took your money under false pretenses. I laughed at you in the store. And you knew what you were doing, and I did not." She studied his face. The pride was gone. The arrogance had drained out of him, leaving behind something raw and human. He was not asking for anything. He was simply standing there, having said the words, waiting to see what she would do. Clara opened the gate. She stepped aside and motioned for him to enter. He hesitated, then walked through, his feet heavy on the turned earth. She led him to the third vine of the western row, the one that had been the most hopeless, the one whose first grape she had tasted. The clusters hung thick and full, the grapes dark and shining in the afternoon light. She picked one and held it out to him. He took it, looked at it, and placed it in his mouth. He chewed slowly, and she watched his face change. The tension in his jaw loosened. The hardness around his eyes softened. He swallowed and looked at the vine, then at the rows beyond, then at her. "It is sweet," he said. "After everything, it is sweet." "Because the roots are deep," she said. "When the roots are deep, the vine can survive anything." He nodded. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "Will you show me how to do what you have done?" She looked at him. The man who had mocked her, the man who had taken her last $3, the man who had represented everything she had fought against, and she saw, in the lines of his face, the same desperation she had felt in November, standing in a dead vineyard with nothing but a notebook and a herd of goats. "I will show you," she said, "but you will have to start at the beginning. You will have to admit that everything you knew was not enough, and you will have to work." He met her eyes. "I am ready." He did not leave until the sun had gone down and the stars had begun to appear. Clara walked him through the vineyard, explaining the role of the goats, the sunchokes, the pruning, the copper spray. He listened without interrupting, asking questions only when he needed clarification. When he finally left, he turned at the gate and said, "I will come back tomorrow, if you will have me." "I will have you," she said. He walked away into the darkness, and Clara stood at the gate, watching him go. The valley was changing. The laughter had died. The mockery had transformed into respect. And the man who had been her loudest critic had become her first student. The harvest came on the first day of October. It was not a large harvest by the standards of the valley, but it was a harvest. Clara and Della worked from dawn until dusk, cutting the clusters, laying them in baskets, carrying them to the root cellar where they would be stored and pressed. The goats watched from the barn, their bells clinking softly, and the sunchokes rustled in the breeze, their golden flowers nodding in the sun. On the second day of the harvest, a wagon came up the lane. It was not Silas Thorne. It was a delegation from Mill Creek. Emmett Hargrove, the storekeeper, driving the wagon. Behind him, the farm wives who had come in the spring, their faces bright with curiosity. And behind them, walking slowly, leaning on a stick, was Martha Deaver. They climbed down and stood at the edge of the vineyard, watching Clara and Della work. The baskets were full. The grapes were dark and heavy. The sunchoke stalks had been cut and stacked for winter feed. The goats were fat and content. And the vineyard, which had been dead for 7 years, was alive. Emmett Hargrove stepped forward. "Miss Whitfield, the county land agent stopped at my store on his way back from your place. He told me the news. The claim is approved. The property is yours, free and clear, and the deed will be recorded by the end of the month." Clara set down her basket. She had known this was coming. She had prepared for it. But hearing the words spoken aloud, in the warm autumn light, with the vineyard full of fruit and the neighbors watching, she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. She felt joy. Martha Deaver walked forward and stood beside her. She did not say congratulations. She did not offer praise. She simply looked at the rows of vines, at the turned soil, at the baskets of grapes, and said, "I told you that the real test would come. It came, and you passed it." Clara nodded. The old woman put her hand on Clara's arm, a brief, firm touch, and then turned and walked back to the wagon. That evening, when the delegation had gone and Della had returned to her own home, Clara sat on the porch of the cabin. The sun was setting over the vineyard, casting long shadows across the rows. The goats had settled in the barn, and the only sound was the rustle of the wind through the drying sunchoke stalks. She held in her hand the single grape she had picked on the 15th of August, the first fruit of the revived vineyard. She had pressed it between the pages of her notebook, preserving it like a pressed flower. It was flat now, dried, the skin wrinkled and dark, but it still held a faint sweetness. She looked at it for a long time. Then she placed it back in the notebook and closed it. The front hides more than it shows. The land hides its secrets beneath the surface. The roots reach down in the dark, unseen, unnoticed, until the day they produce fruit that cannot be denied. And the woman who trusts the soil, who listens to the wild plants, who does not surrender to the laughter of the skeptical, she is the one who uncovers what the frontier kept hidden. This is Elias Vance, and you have been listening to Frontier Secrets. Subscribe and step back in time. The frontier hides more than it shows.